So why the Theology of Dolly Parton, right? WWDD. As a child growing up in Detroit, I most often listened to the Motown sound. My parents had an extensive record collection. It's okay with me if they cry. A church that's not crying is dying, I always say. It's all good. I think it's great. So, my parents had an extensive record collection, and my father had this fancy stereo wired into a closet. Now, you need to think back, because this might not sound impressive today, but he had speakers all over the house, and by flipping a switch circa 1975, 78, the whole house would be filled with music. And so while Aretha Franklin and Marvin Gaye and the Jackson 5 and Johnny Mathis were always frequently in the stack on the turntable, there was one outlier in the collection, Dolly Parton. I would sit on the floor looking at the album covers, and they all seemed like a fantasy land with wild costumes and grand layers of sequins, but one stood out the most, Dolly Parton. And the pictures on that album were like a cross between a fairy tale and mythology. And as a child who attended a very strict, traditionally Catholic school, I certainly noticed her really big hair and large breasts. And how did either get so large was a question I had of both attributes. Now, in working here with our worship council, I often give some options of things I might preach about or things we could learn about. And I offered up a number of topics, and when I mentioned Dolly Parton, hands down, they wanted Dolly. So I planned it into the schedule, and knowing this would be at least my third time, maybe more, preaching about her, I thought I should make a pilgrimage to Dollywood for the first time. So I spent a long weekend in the Smoky Mountains this fall, hiking, and you kind of see the mix of everything in Dolly, you know, relaxing and examining the place that seated so many of her famous songs. Best day ever. That's Reverend Matt and I, we had a lot of fun. And there's statues of her, and there's also this interesting mix of the beauty of the place and then the more typical Christian theology, and for the first time I experienced what was a Trump store. That's what it was called, you know, and so it's just this mix of all these different things. She has all the fantasy, her butterfly tree that plays a whole laser light show. I was there at Halloween, which I love, and all of the decor was amazing. I loved it. And so, in a world where we continue to be inundated with fear tactics, I mean, the fear is manufactured and played for us over and over and over. It's dividing us, right? Lately, Dolly's been in the news again. Now, I don't know if you've been paying attention to how many terrible bans have gone on just in the last 2 weeks on transgender healthcare, on outlawing all gender bathrooms, on saying that healthcare providers have to report things that might be out of a gender heteronormative norm. That's right. We heard from Dolly again, and she said something that she's talked about before. She said, if I wasn't born a woman, I'd be a drag queen. She also says that she dresses more provocatively and with more glitter and sequins than most drag queens, and so she knows that she would be first in line to be arrested. She regularly speaks out for the inclusion of gay and transgender people in media and including in her Netflix specials. Dolly represents some of the best of us. Unitarian Universalist Theology asks us not to just become better ourselves, but to help one another be kinder and more loving humans. And Dolly does just that, in a manner that doesn't give in to the fear. She doesn't make her world smaller. She could decide to not go out in public. She was in Dollywood this weekend as the Grand Dreamer in Chief, right? Decorated in a car laden with flowers. She could decide to only appeal to the typical country western music bent of Christian conservatives, but instead Dolly embraces Jesus and God and queers and goes all the way to make rides far more accessible too. Dolly is universally beloved. So that Q score I talked about, that's a measure of how well people think your brand performs globally. They have all this math that goes into it, and they assess a very diverse sample of people, and they ask them all kinds of questions. And out of all these different brands out there, all the performers, she's top 10 globally in terms of everybody's favorites. She's close to number 1, like I mentioned, when we talk about the lack of negatives. People see her as a positive force in our world. So what's her formula for us UUs that we could learn from this saintly hero? Dolly never actually comes out and describes her worldview as a theology, but we can look at her life through a few different lenses. We see very clear theological themes serving as a compass that guides her decisions. WWDD. One of these theologies could be described as being yourself. Much like we heard from Dolly in our Time for All Ages, Coat of Many Colors, it honors growing up poor. She had no running water unless you ran to get it, she says. She grew up evangelical Christian, and she claims today that she does not go to church, though she has one built in her home complex. She feels deeply spiritual but not religious. She has ongoing talks with God and cites the Bible as one of her favorite books. When the New York Times asked her pretty recently what was on her nightstand, it was the queer black science fiction writer Octavia Butler's books and the Bible. Now, if you don't know the works of Octavia Butler, the award-winning science fiction writer who described back in the 80s a Nazi-like president that would run in 2020 under the slogan of Make America Great Again, you might want to check that out and think about what it might mean to have those two authors' books on your nightstand. Dolly grew up so poor and isolated in the mountains of Tennessee that Dolly Parton's America podcast, which I highly recommend, recorded a story of her stepping on a broken mason jar as a child and her 2 toes dangling, getting cut off. Her brothers held her down while her mom poured kerosene on the open wound and sewed her skin up with probably the same needle and thread that made the coat of many colors. As we think about the issues of classism in this country, this kind of truth is often not spoken. Dolly hides nothing about her country, hillbilly, backwoods background, and this kind of truth-telling about who you are and where you come from. And what stories make up your being are the kind of stories that let us into your heart, like the ones that Carolina was talking about today. There's no shame in your background, and Dolly proves it. Another way her theology appears is when I see as her personal dedication to covenant. She frequently tells stories about her promises that she has made to herself. And covenants are that. They are promises. They are promises to us and promises to others. And one covenant we see that I just described, she never pretends to be someone she's not. She's honest. She doesn't say mean or cruel things about anyone. You would be hard-pressed to hear Dolly putting down anyone or any group. She frequently states, I have opinions, but they are mine. I am an entertainer. I know I have fans on both sides of the aisles, and I am not going to make any statement about that. Even when she's pressed or presented with someone unkind or even evil, she often will say to an audience or an interviewer, maybe we should pray for them. The most profound story of Dolly following her personal covenant is one of never selling any of her songs. People could record them and pay her for the rights, but never own them. That was her personal covenant, stating, this is the stuff I'm leaving for my family when I'm dead and gone. That money goes for stuff my brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews need, so I can't give up half the publishing. Dolly wrote the song, I Will Always Love You, in 1973, a great year, as a tribute to her musical partner, Porter Wagoner. After 7 years of singing together, and in many ways him helping to really ascend her career, Dolly was heading out on her own, but she wanted Wagoner to know that despite their professional breakup, she will always care deeply for him. She ended the relationship by going into his office and singing, I Will Always Love You. And it was a hit for Parton even then, and soon after it attracted the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. And he wanted to sing his own version of the ballad, and so his manager, the famous Colonel, reached out to Dolly to strike a deal. And Dolly told CNBC, Elvis had wanted to record it, and I had been invited to come down to the studio and hear him, and it was a couple of days before Colonel Tom Parker, who was Presley's manager at the time, and many said he was a hard person to say no to, he called and said, now you know, Elvis don't record anything unless we get half the publishing. Dolly said she cried all night thinking about that decision. Elvis was the king, and while Dolly Parton was known, she was just a few years away from her childhood poverty. And I want to pause here and have you think about that notion. Think of someone you think is awe-striking, who might even have power over you. Someone with all kinds of ways of getting what they want. Maybe you've had that in a boss or a parent. Think about that power. And for those of us who grew up in poverty, or even lived most of their life that way, it's hard, if not impossible, to leave that mindset even when your income changes. Dolly was presented with a money-making option that would bring her fame and fortune, and she said no. That is covenant. Dolly had a personal covenant with herself that guided her business acumen and ethical decision-making, and people told her, you're nuts. It's Elvis Presley. I mean, I'd give him all of it. However, Dolly said that there was something deep in her heart that just said, don't do that. And so she listened to her instincts, and this decision paid off because in 1992, Whitney Houston recorded the hugely popular version of I Will Always Love You for the Bodyguard movie. And Dolly joked that with all the royalties she received from Houston's version of that song, she made enough money to buy Graceland and then some. Finally, I want to lift up about why Dolly Parton is someone we should follow the example of. Now, Dolly really looks at mistakes she's made and admits them. And she makes amends and applies forgiveness to both herself and others. In her process of doing that, she widens the circle. Where have you heard that before? The book I keep telling you to read from the UUA, right? From the study. She could embrace fear, and instead, she goes wider. She goes deeper. Dolly says forgiveness is all there is. Now, y'all, that sounds nice, but how many of us can really do it? There are countless stories of Dolly's forgiveness in action, including what she did for past business partner Porter Wagoner when he was going broke. She bought his whole music collection, and then she gave it back to him so that he would have enough money to support his family and be able to leave his children those songs. One of the Dolly-themed dining experiences that you can have in Pigeon Forge, right next to Dollywood, is to go to Dolly's Stampede. Now, the Stampede has had a lot of controversy around it. It was formerly known as Dolly Parton's Dixie Stampede, a dinner theater that presented the Civil War as a friendly competition between neighbors. And in the wake of the Charlottesville riots in 2017, the Dixie Stampede was called out by the press. And it became embroiled in a larger national conversation about the Civil War monuments and the whitewashing of history. Dolly's business conglomerate decided to eliminate Dixie from the name, which caused further uproar. Now, I want you to really think about when someone tells you they don't like something you did and how that might influence you. I don't know about you, but for me, I lose sleep. It can be one person. I can have influenced hundreds of people that were loving something, and one person can complain and my stomach will pit, and I will wonder and I will debate. She lost money. She had threats. She could have gone into the fear. One writer describes the Dixie Stampede is the one place in the Dolly verse that didn't quite land right for her. The Dolly she grew up with as the woman sassing back to her boss in the movie 9 to 5, and then the Dolly, you know, the wit and the verve and the staunch supporter of all kinds of underdogs, including LGBT people. And then this idea that she encountered in the South, and especially at that stampede. You may remember Charlottesville, there had been that movement to take down the 2 Confederate statues, and the people who didn't want that to happen, they were surrounding all the churches where our leaders were inside trying to protect the other leaders of color, right? Susan Frederick Gray, our UUA president, was down there. Lots of ministers I admire of all different faiths were down there. And there were all these hate groups, and the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis and the Proud Boys. And one person died and 19 were injured after a speeding vehicle drove into a group of protesters who were marching peacefully through downtown Charlotte. The interfaith clergy were locked arm in arm and were feet away from getting hit. And suddenly this conversation, which had been like bubbling up for a while, it burst onto the national stage, and questions about who gets to write the history that we take as fact. And we're now hearing this year, right, that it's being outlawed. You can't learn those facts, right? They're censoring it out of textbooks. Who gets to be honored? So the writer who really was following this, Aisha Harris, decides to fly from New York to Pigeon Forge and do a theater review of the Dixie Stampede. And the tone was really funny, but also quite critical. Why are there signs over the bathroom saying Northerners and Southerners only? And why is there zero mention of slavery? Pete Owens is one of Dolly's managers, and he said after the article landed, the team huddled together with Dolly, and they decided to remove the word Dixie from the name, and then some. They realized it had been hurtful. Well, there's several reasons that we changed the name, Dolly says, and one being out of ignorance. People do things because you just don't know, and a lot of my things that I do wrong are just out of pure ignorance, really, because you grow up a certain way and you don't know. The Dixie we always thought of, way down in the land of Dixie, it's like Dixieland or Dixieland music. Dixie, I just thought Dixie is a part of America. And it was offensive because, like I say, out of ignorance, you don't know you're hurting people. And I never thought of it as being about slavery or any of that, she says. But when it was brought to our attention and some woman wrote about it, and I thought, well, Lord have mercy. I would never want to hurt anybody for any reason. And being a businesswoman, we really didn't have that many people say anything about it. Now, if you read the press, that's a little different, but she saw it her way, right? I don't want to do that. So we completely cleared it all out. We shut down, we started over, we reconfigured the entire thing. But I wanted to fix it because I don't ever want to hurt or offend anyone. And so I did it as a good faith effort to show that it was never meant to cause anyone pain. Forgiving is one thing. Public forgiving and making amends has greater stakes. She was threatened, and she didn't give in to the pressure or fear. And in doing that, she drew the circle wider. She included more people. She made a new way. She stood up against hate. Now I can tell you the lines are still out the door at the Dolly Stampede that doesn't have Dixie in its name anymore. I didn't go, that was just too much for me. But I did go in the glitter bus. people who have been pampered or hold privilege like Dolly now has might want to protect that and not let others in. She could have cried out, "How could anyone think that's what I meant? I didn't mean anything like that. I mean, I didn't intend to hurt people." She could have stayed there. But intent is different than impact, and her impact was hurt. So instead, she took risks that her comfort and ease would be disrupted, and she spent money and time to reconfigure the whole place. And in doing that, the circle drew wider. And now it can be enjoyed by even more people. You get the idea. I could go on for hours and hours with more examples of different ways she lives her life as an example. And time after time, we see her giving away her fortune. She opens herself up, speaking her truth. She doesn't worry that she'll be punished in sales or popularity or vengeance. She just rises above and keeps preaching love and inclusion. Now, our story today was from the Imagination Library, and that's Dolly's book gifting program that gifts free books to children from ages birth to 5 in participating communities in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and the Republic of Ireland. They've given away more than 200 million books. Dolly says, "When I was growing up in the hills of East Tennessee, I knew my dreams would come true. I knew there are children in your community with their own dreams. They may dream of becoming a doctor or an inventor or a minister." She said it, not me. "Who knows, maybe there's a little girl whose dream is out there to be a writer and a singer. And the seeds of these dreams are often found in books and the seeds you help plant in your community, and they can grow across the world." Now she started this, now imagine this, she started this not because she came from a family of readers. She was inspired by her father's inability to read and write. And so she started the Imagination Library in '95 for the children within her home county first. And now that program spans 5 countries and gives over 1 million free books each month to children around the world. Now we can follow her example this month because we're having a book drive, right? And there's news about it, and there's book boxes, and we're looking for children's books and books about women, and we're encouraged by Bernie's book drive to make sure we include books of diverse subjects and anti-racism and LGBT and all the things, right? Pro-girl, all that stuff. It's hard not to love her. The $1 million she gave toward developing the Moderna vaccine for COVID has pushed her back into the limelight, and it upped the ante for folks who call her Saint Dolly. So what? You might think, that's Dolly, but I can't do that. How does it apply to us? We can follow her example from the micro to the macro. She says, "Find out who you are and do it on purpose." We could quote the golden rule at our next family gathering, or pipe that the Bible is clear that we are not to judge others. We could step through our fears and learn to draw the circle wider. In interim ministry classes that I take to become a certified interim, we are told all the time the things that our churches do that make UU churches grow and thrive are the things that no one else is willing to talk about. Gender and race and sex and abortion and the earth. That's what we have to go to, not hide from it. Dolly says, "I think maybe it's the things we don't want to talk about that are the things people most want to hear. They're looking for a place to sit with the truth and lay it down and hold it." So we could tell our own truth without shame and use it to empower others. Or as Dolly said in the writing of the film Dumplin', which I highly recommend, "At this point, there's nothing left to be done. And if there is anything, it's too late to make the effort. All she can do is let the glitter fall where it may."